Every father wants to give his child a real home. For David Johnson, a struggling single dad working 2 jobs, that dream seemed impossible until a lawyer called about an inheritance from a great-uncle he'd never met. The old cabin looked like junk to everyone else. Neighbors laughed and said it should be torn down, but David saw hope. He saw a place where his 8-year-old son Marcus could have his own room, where they could build something together. The first week seemed perfect. Marcus loved exploring the woods, and David felt proud watching his boy run free. Then strange things started happening. Marcus began drawing pictures of rooms in the cabin that didn't exist. David found those rooms. The cabin had been waiting for them, and it wanted them to stay forever. But what was the real reason the cabin chose them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Johnson had learned early that life rarely handed out second chances. Standing in the cramped kitchenette of their downtown apartment, washing dishes in a sink that had been leaking for 3 months, he watched 8-year-old Marcus hunched over homework at their second-hand dining table. The boy's tongue peeked out in concentration as he worked through multiplication problems, his pencil worn down to a stub. The apartment walls seemed to press closer every day. 2 bedrooms in name only. David had given Marcus the actual bedroom while he slept on a pull-out couch that groaned with every movement. The heating barely worked, the neighbors upstairs fought until dawn, and the building's entrance smelled permanently of garbage and disappointment. David dried his hands on a threadbare towel, studying the school photo of Marcus propped against the windowsill. The frame had cracked last winter when it fell during one of the upstairs neighbors' more violent arguments. He'd taped it back together, but the crack ran right through Marcus's smile, a daily reminder of how fragile everything felt. "Dad, what's 7 times 8? Marcus called out, eraser shavings scattered around his worksheet. "Work it out, buddy. You know this one." David settled beside his son, inhaling the scent of the discount shampoo they shared. "Remember what we practiced?" Marcus scrunched his face, counting on his fingers beneath the table. 56. "That's my smart boy." David ruffled his son's hair, noting how it needed cutting again. Another expense to juggle. The first job started at midnight, 4 hours of mopping floors and emptying trash bins at the downtown office complex. The second began at dawn on weekends, landscaping for clients who barely acknowledged his existence. Between them, he scraped together enough for rent, utilities, and groceries, with nothing left for the things that mattered. Marcus needed new shoes, his sneakers held together with duct tape. They'd been eating pasta 3 nights a week for months. David's grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She'd done her best on her pension, but there was never enough money for extras like school trips or new clothes. She'd passed when Marcus was 3, leaving David with her wisdom, but no inheritance beyond a $20 bill tucked in her Bible. Marcus's mother, Jasmine, had lasted 2 years before deciding motherhood wasn't the adventure she'd signed up for. She'd left on a Tuesday morning while Marcus napped, taking only her clothes and the emergency cash David kept hidden in the coffee tin. No forwarding address, no explanation beyond a note saying she needed to find herself. That was 6 years ago. Marcus sometimes asked about her, but less frequently now. David had stopped hoping she'd call. The lawyer's phone call had come on a Thursday evening while David helped Marcus with reading homework. The voice was crisp, professional, explaining that David's great-uncle Ezra Johnson had died 3 weeks earlier and left him property in the mountains of Pine Ridge, Colorado. "I'm sorry, who?" David had asked, pausing Marcus's reading of a story about a boy and his dog, Ezra Johnson. "He specified you as his sole heir. The property consists of a cabin and approximately 12 acres of forested land." David had never heard of any Uncle Ezra. His grandmother had been private about family history, changing the subject whenever David asked about relatives. But the lawyer had documentation, birth certificates, family records stretching back decades, all confirming the connection. The drive to Pine Ridge took 8 hours in David's aging Honda, Marcus chattering excitedly in the back seat about mountains and wild animals. They'd packed everything they owned into 4 suitcases and a handful of boxes. The apartment landlord had been surprisingly understanding about the early lease termination, probably relieved to have the unit back for renovation. Pine Ridge clung to the mountainside like an afterthought. Population 847, according to the weather-beaten welcome sign. Main Street consisted of a diner, a hardware store, a combination gas station and convenience mart, and a few other businesses that looked like they'd been operating since the 1970s. The surrounding peaks stretched endlessly under an afternoon sky so blue it made David's chest ache with possibility. "Look, Dad." Marcus pressed his face against the window as they drove through town. "There's horses." A small ranch occupied the valley floor, horses grazing peacefully in afternoon light. David hadn't seen his son this animated in months. In the city, Marcus had grown cautious, staying close to David's side on walks, flinching at loud noises. Here his eyes sparkled with curiosity and wonder. The directions led them up a winding dirt road that climbed steadily into dense pine forest. David's Honda struggled with the altitude and incline, engine laboring as they climbed higher. Mailboxes appeared sporadically, marking invisible driveways that disappeared into the trees. Finally, they found the weathered wooden sign, E. Johnson, 1247 Pine Ridge Road. The driveway was more suggestion than actual road. 2 dirt tracks separated by a strip of weeds and wildflowers. David navigated carefully around potholes and fallen branches until the trees opened into a small clearing. The cabin sat like a forgotten thought in the center of the space. Built from logs that had aged to silver gray, it sagged in places where the foundation had settled unevenly. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away, and the front porch tilted at an angle that suggested structural problems. Windows were intact but grimy, reflecting the forest like sleepy eyes, but David saw past the decay. He saw the solid log construction, the craftsmanship in the joinery, the way the building seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. The clearing was large enough for a vegetable garden, maybe a workshop. Marcus could have the forest as his backyard. "Is this really ours?" Marcus whispered, stepping out of the car. "It really is, buddy." They walked the perimeter together, Marcus running ahead to investigate every interesting rock and fallen log. The silence was profound after years of city noise. No traffic, no sirens, no shouting neighbors. Just whine through pine branches and the distant call of a bird David couldn't identify. Inside, the cabin revealed itself as more substantial than its exterior suggested. The main room featured a stone fireplace blackened by decades of use, windows on 3 sides offering views of the surrounding forest. A small kitchen occupied one corner, its appliances ancient but functional. 2 bedrooms flanked a narrow hallway, with a bathroom that showed signs of relatively recent plumbing updates. Dust covered everything, and mice had claimed the kitchen cabinets, but the bones were good. The wood floors were solid beneath their feet. The walls stood straight and true. "This room could be yours," David told Marcus, opening the door to the smaller bedroom. It faced east, promising morning sunlight, with a window that looked out toward the mountain peaks. Marcus bounced on his toes, grinning. "Can we stay forever?" David knelt to his son's eye level, hands on Marcus's shoulders. "We can stay as long as you want." They spent their first evening unpacking by the light of old lamps, sharing a dinner of peanut butter sandwiches while sitting on the dusty floor. Marcus chattered about all the things they could do, hiking trails, building a treehouse, maybe getting a dog. David listened and planned, weatherproofing the roof, fixing the porch, making the place truly livable before winter. As Marcus settled into his sleeping bag in his new room, David sat on the front porch despite the evening chill. The stars here were nothing like the few visible through city light pollution. Here they spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, so numerous they seemed to pulse with collective light. For the first time in years, David allowed himself to believe in possibility. This place could be their sanctuary, their new beginning. He could fix what was broken, improve what needed improving, create the stable home Marcus deserved. An owl called from the forest, answered by another from across the clearing. Night sounds gradually emerged as David sat listening. rustling in the underbrush, the distant howl of something wild and free. It felt like the world welcoming them home. Inside, Marcus was already asleep, exhausted by excitement and travel. David checked on him before settling into his own sleeping bag in the main room. He'd sleep here until he could set up a proper bed, but that seemed like a small sacrifice for this opportunity. As he drifted off, David thought about tomorrow's plans. There was so much to do, so many improvements to make, but they had time now, and space, and most importantly, they had each other. The cabin creaked gently around them. As it settled into the cool mountain night, wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. To David, it sounded like the place was learning to accommodate new residents after standing empty for so long. He fell asleep planning their future, unaware that something else was also making plans for their stay. The first week passed in a blur of activity that left David more optimistic than he'd felt in years. Each morning brought new discoveries and small victories. The well water ran clear and cold, the propane tanks were half full, and the old generator in the shed started on the third try. Marcus threw himself into exploring with the enthusiasm of a city kid suddenly freed into wilderness. David enrolled Marcus at Pine Ridge Elementary, a one-story building that served all grades with a total enrollment of 43 students. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, was a woman in her 60s who'd taught 3 generations of local families. She welcomed Marcus warmly, though David caught the subtle questions about their background, their plans, their connection to old Ezra Johnson. "Your great-uncle kept to himself mostly," Mrs. Henderson explained as they walked Marcus to his classroom. "Came to town maybe once a month for supplies. Polite enough, but private. Folks respected that." Marcus integrated quickly with his new classmates, coming home each day with stories about recess games and playground adventures. The other children seemed fascinated by his tales of city life, and he was equally enthralled by their knowledge of mountain wildlife and forest secrets. The locals David encountered in town were friendly but reserved. At the hardware store, buying supplies for roof repairs, he met Tom Bradley, a weathered man who'd lived in Pine Ridge his entire 68 years. "You planning to winter up there?" Tom asked, ringing up David's purchases of roofing cement and replacement shingles. "That's the plan." "Why?" Tom's expression shifted subtly. "Nothing wrong with the place, mind you. Just that it can get mighty isolated once the snow starts. Phone lines go down regular, and that road's not getting plowed till spring. We'll manage. I grew up dealing with tough winters. I'm sure you will." Tom handed him the receipt, just saying, "If you need anything, anything at all, don't hesitate to come to town. We take care of our neighbors here." There was something in Tom's tone that suggested he knew more than he was sharing, but David didn't press. Every small town had its characters and stories. He was more focused on the practical business of making the cabin livable. The radio appeared on their third night. David was replacing a broken window pane in the kitchen when he heard music drifting from the main room. Not modern music, but something older, a woman's voice singing a ballad accompanied by piano. The kind of recording that sounded like it came from decades past. He found Marcus sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening intently to an old Philco radio that definitely hadn't been there earlier. "Where did this come from?" David asked, noting the radio's pristine condition despite its vintage appearance. "I found it in my closet," Marcus said without looking away from the device. "Can we keep it? The lady has a pretty voice." David examined the radio more closely. The wood cabinet gleamed as if freshly polished, and the dial face showed stations from cities that probably didn't broadcast anymore. KDKA Pittsburgh, WGN Chicago, stations that belonged to an earlier era of American radio. "I guess so," David said, though something about finding it nagged at him. He'd been through the entire cabin during their initial exploration. How had he missed something this substantial? The music continued for another hour, switching between old songs and what sounded like radio dramas from the 1940s. Marcus seemed entranced, sitting quietly and listening with unusual focus for an 8-year-old. When David woke the next morning, the radio was silent. That afternoon, while David worked on patching the roof, Marcus came running from the forest edge, eyes wide with excitement. "Dad! Dad! There's a basement!" David climbed down from the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What do you mean, a basement?" "Under the house. I found the door." Marcus grabbed his father's hand, pulling him around to the cabin's north side. Hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes was a wooden door set into what David had assumed was just a stone foundation wall. The door was painted green, though the color had faded to the point where it barely distinguished itself from the weathered wood. David pulled away the brush and tested the handle. The door opened easily, revealing wooden steps leading down into darkness that smelled of earth and old wood. "Stay here while I check it out," David instructed, retrieving a flashlight from his toolbox. The basement was larger than the cabin's footprint should have allowed, extending under what must be the front porch and possibly beyond. Rough stone walls supported heavy wooden beams, and the floor was packed earth that had been smoothed by decades of use. Old mason jars lined shelves along one wall, their contents long since spoiled and unidentifiable. A workbench occupied another wall, hand tools arranged with the careful precision of someone who'd spent considerable time down here. But what caught David's attention was the door at the far end, another wooden door that seemed to lead deeper into the hillside. "Is it safe?" Marcus called from above. "Seems to be. Come on down, but be careful on the steps." Marcus descended slowly, flashlight beam dancing across the walls as he looked around in wonder. "It's like a secret hideout." David tested the far door, but it wouldn't budge. Probably swollen shut from decades of mountain humidity, he reasoned. The basement itself was dry enough, well ventilated by small windows near the ceiling, that he hadn't noticed from outside. "Can this be my fort?" Marcus asked, already envisioning possibilities. "We'll see. Let me make sure it's safe first." That evening, as David prepared dinner, he heard Marcus talking animatedly in his room. Assuming the boy was playing with toys, David didn't investigate until he realized the conversation seemed two-sided. Marcus, pausing as if listening to responses, then continuing with apparent replies. "Who are you talking to, buddy?" David asked from the doorway. Marcus looked up from where he sat on his sleeping bag, surrounded by paper and crayons. "Lucy. She lives here too." "Lucy? She's been here a long time. She likes my drawings." Marcus held up a sheet of paper covered in crayon marks that vaguely resembled the cabin's interior, but with additional rooms David didn't recognize. "She showed me where the hidden rooms are." David felt a familiar parental concern. It wasn't unusual for children to have imaginary friends, especially during times of transition. Moving to an isolated cabin in a new state certainly qualified as significant change. "What does Lucy look like?" David asked, sitting on the floor beside his son. "She's about my age, I think. She has blonde hair and a blue dress. She's sad sometimes because she's been alone for so long." Marcus selected a blue crayon and began adding details to his drawing. "She's happy we're here now." David studied the drawing more carefully. The additional rooms Marcus had sketched actually made architectural sense, a logical extension of the cabin's layout that suggested someone with spatial intelligence had conceived them. "Where are these rooms, Marcus?" "Behind the kitchen and upstairs." Marcus pointed to his drawing. "Lucy says her dad built them for her but never got to finish." David knew there was no upstairs to the cabin and certainly no additional rooms behind the kitchen. But children's imaginations could be remarkably detailed and persistent. Over the next few days, the radio continued its intermittent performances, always when Marcus was present, always featuring music from decades past. Sometimes David caught fragments of voices between songs, conversations that sounded real but discussed people and events he couldn't identify. Marcus's drawings became increasingly detailed, showing not just the cabin as it existed, but as it might have existed with additions and modifications. He drew furniture in rooms that didn't exist, windows that looked out onto views impossible from the cabin's actual position, And always, in the corner of each drawing, was a small figure with blonde hair and a blue dress. David began experiencing his first restless nights. The cabin's natural settling sounds seemed amplified in the mountain stillness. Creaking boards, shifting timbers, the whisper of wind through gaps in the foundation. Several times he woke convinced someone was walking around upstairs, footsteps crossing back and forth above his sleeping area. But there was no upstairs. On their 8th night, David woke to find Marcus's sleeping bag empty. Grabbing his flashlight, heart hammering against his ribs, David searched the cabin quickly and quietly. No sign of his son anywhere inside. The front door was still locked, the windows secure. Then he remembered the basement. He found Marcus sitting on the packed earth floor, facing the sealed door at the basement's far end. The boy was talking quietly, occasionally nodding as if receiving responses to his words. "Marcus?" David kept his voice gentle. "What are you doing down here?" Marcus turned with a smile that seemed older than his 8 years. "Lucy wanted to show me something. She says there are more rooms through there, but the door got stuck a long time ago." David knelt beside his son, noting the child's complete comfort in the dark basement. "You shouldn't come down here alone, especially at night. It's not safe. Lucy keeps me safe. She's been keeping the whole place safe, waiting for us to come home." The word home struck David as significant. Marcus had never referred to anywhere as home. Before, not their apartment, not his grandmother's house when David was growing up. For a child who'd moved frequently due to financial pressures, the concept of home had been more aspirational than real. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you back to bed." As they climbed the basement steps, Marcus looked back once toward the sealed door. "Lucy says tomorrow she'll show me the upstairs rooms." David glanced up at the cabin's roofline, clearly visible in the moonlight. There were definitely no upstairs rooms. But as he locked the basement door and guided Marcus back inside, David couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin felt different than when they'd first arrived. Not bigger exactly, but more complex, as if it was revealing itself gradually. One mystery at a time, the radio was playing again, very softly. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby that seemed designed to help children fall asleep. David spent the next morning at the Pine Ridge Public Library, a small building that smelled of old paper and housed 3 decades of local newspapers on microfilm. The librarian, Martha Coswell, was a thin woman in her 70s who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd organized the same shelves for 40 years. "Researching the Johnson property?" she asked, when David explained his interest in the cabin's history. Her tone carried a weight that suggested this wasn't the first such inquiry. "I inherited it recently. Just curious about its background." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Ezra kept to himself, but the property has quite a history. Been through 7 owners since the 1960s. That's unusual for mountain property. Most folks who move up here plan to stay." She guided him to a table where she'd already laid out several bound volumes of the Pine Ridge Gazette, along with property records from the county courthouse. "Start with 1963, Martha suggested. "That's when the Whitmore family built the place. Tragedy struck that winter." David opened the first volume, scanning headlines until he found what he was looking for. "Local family perishes in winter storm. Father and mother found dead. Daughter missing." The article, dated February 14, 1963, described how Harold and Margaret Whitmore had been found dead in their car at the bottom of Pine Ridge Canyon during a severe blizzard. They'd apparently attempted to drive to town for supplies when their vehicle skidded off the icy road. Their daughter Lucy, age 7, had not been in the car. Search teams had found no trace of her despite 3 days of intensive searching once the storm passed. The follow-up articles painted a grim picture. Lucy's body was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the surrounding forest. The prevailing theory was that she'd wandered into the woods looking for her parents and succumbed to exposure. Her remains were presumably scattered by wildlife. The cabin had stood empty for 2 years before being sold to the Morrison family, who'd lasted 8 months before leaving abruptly. The Gazette reported their departure with a brief, Notice about a family emergency requiring immediate relocation. After the Morrisons came the Hendersons, no relation to the school. Principal, who'd managed 18 months before also leaving suddenly. Then the Cassidys, the Rodriguezes, the Blakes, and finally David's great-uncle Ezra, who'd purchased the property in 1995 and held it longer than any previous owner. Each family's departure was noted briefly, always with vague explanations about job relocations or family circumstances. Never any mention of problems with the property itself. Strange pattern, David observed. Martha nodded, settling into the chair across from him. Folks in town have theories, of course. Some say the place is cursed. Others think it's just too isolated for most families. The truth is probably simpler. Mountain living isn't for everyone, but her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe her own explanation. Did you know any of these families personally? The Morrisons had a boy about your son's age. Sweet child, but he started having trouble sleeping, talking about voices in the walls. Parents thought it was adjustment issues from moving to the mountains. Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. Then there were the Rodriguezes. Their daughter claimed she had a playmate in the cabin, another little girl she'd talked to for hours. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. What happened to them? Nothing dramatic. They just packed up one day and left. Maria Rodriguez told me later that her daughter had become convinced this playmate was real, would insist they set a place for her at dinner, leave toys out for her to use. Martha's expression grew troubled. Some children have very active imaginations. What about my great-uncle? How did he manage to stay so long? Ezra was different. He lived alone, no children, and he seemed to understand the place in a way the families never did. Martha pulled out a manila folder she'd kept separate from the other materials. He came in here regularly, always researching the same thing, the Whitmore family tragedy. The folder contained photocopies of newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be floor plans of the cabin drawn in Ezra's careful script. David studied the plans with growing unease. They showed rooms that didn't exist, a second floor with 3 bedrooms, additional space behind the kitchen, an extended basement that seemed to tunnel into the hillside. Did he ever explain why he was so interested in the Whitmores? He believed Lucy didn't die in the woods. Martha lowered her voice, despite the library's emptiness. He thought she made it back to the cabin and somehow survived the winter alone. He spent years looking for evidence that she'd lived there after her parents' death. David studied Ezra's notes more carefully. Page after page of observations about temperature variations in different rooms, unexplained sounds, objects that moved from where he'd placed them. It read like the journal of someone documenting supernatural activity. Did he ever find proof? Martha hesitated. 3 years ago, Ezra brought me something. Said he'd found it hidden in the cabin's walls during renovation work. She opened her desk drawer and withdrew a small wooden doll, clearly handmade, with painted features worn smooth by handling. The doll wore a tiny blue dress and had blonde hair made from real human hair. David's hands trembled as he examined it. The craftsmanship was excellent, the kind of careful work that suggested it had been deeply loved. But what struck him most was how perfectly it matched Marcus's descriptions of Lucy. Ezra believed Lucy made this doll to keep herself company during that terrible winter. He thought she'd survived alone in the cabin for months, maybe even years, before... Martha stopped herself. Before what? Before she became something else. Ezra's theory was that a child couldn't survive that kind of isolation and trauma without changing, becoming something that wasn't entirely human anymore. Martha took the doll back, handling it with obvious reluctance. He thought Lucy was still in the cabin, trapped between life and death, sustained by loneliness and the need for companionship. David felt the pieces clicking together with uncomfortable precision. Marcus's imaginary friend, the mysterious rooms he drew, the radio that played music from Lucy's era, the basement door that led to spaces that shouldn't exist. Why didn't Ezra leave? He felt responsible for her. Said if Lucy was really trapped there, someone needed to keep her company, prevent her from becoming desperate enough to... Martha paused again. To what? to reach out to other children who came to the cabin. Ezra believed that's why families with children never lasted. Lucy would try to keep the children with her, make them her permanent companions. David thought about Marcus's recent behavior, his contentment with staying in the basement, his detailed knowledge of rooms that didn't exist, his complete comfort with what should have been frightening isolation. "I need to get home," David said. Standing abruptly, "Mr. Johnson." Martha's voice stopped him at the door. "Ezra left something for you specifically. He knew about you and your son, had been tracking your family for years. He left this cabin to you deliberately." She handed him an envelope with David's name written in careful script. "He said to give this to you only if you came asking." Questions about Lucy. David tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket without reading it. He needed to get back to the cabin, needed to check on Marcus, needed to understand what he'd gotten them into. The drive up the mountain seemed longer than usual, each curve revealing forest that looked less welcoming than it had that morning. By the time he reached the cabin, the afternoon shadows were stretching across the clearing, and the building itself seemed to huddle more deeply into the surrounding trees. Marcus was sitting on the front porch, that wooden doll in his hands, talking to it in quiet, serious tones. David's blood went cold. The doll that should have been locked in Martha's library desk was here, in his son's possession, as if it had never left. "Marcus." David approached carefully. "Where did you get that?" Marcus looked up with a smile that seemed older and sadder than any 8-year-old should possess. "Lucy gave it to me. She said it used to be hers, but she wants me to have it now." The doll's painted eyes seemed to track David's movement as he sat beside his son on the porch steps. Up close, he could see details Martha's library lighting had missed. Tiny stitches in the blue dress, individual strands of real hair carefully attached to the wooden head, fingernail marks in the wood where small hands had gripped it tightly during long, lonely nights. "She's not imaginary, is she?" David asked quietly. Marcus shook his head, still focused on the doll. "She's been waiting for us to come home for a very long time." That night, David waited until Marcus was asleep before opening Ezra's letter. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he stared at the sealed envelope, gathering courage to read whatever his great-uncle had left for him. The letter was written in the same careful script he'd seen on the cabin floor plans. "David, if you're reading this, it means you've started asking the right questions. I've been watching your family for 15 years, waiting for the right time to bring you home. Lucy chose Marcus before he was even born. She's been patient, but her patience has limits. I know this sounds impossible, but everything you're experiencing is real." Lucy Whitmore died in this cabin during the winter of 1963, but death isn't always final for children who die with unfinished business. She's been trapped here, aging without growing, learning without living, desperate for the companionship that was stolen from her. I've managed to keep her calm for 30 years by being here, by acknowledging her presence, by treating her with the respect she deserves. But I'm old now, and Lucy needs more than an elderly man's company. She needs a family. She needs a brother. Marcus is special. He can see her, hear her, interact with her in ways most people can't. This is both a gift and a danger. Lucy's loneliness has made her possessive. She will try to keep him with her permanently if she thinks there's any chance of losing him again. The cabin changes to accommodate Lucy's needs. Rooms appear when she wills them into existence. The basement extends further into the mountain than physics should allow. The upstairs, she shows Marcus, exists in the space between what is and what she remembers from before her death. You have a choice to make. You can take Marcus and leave, but Lucy will follow. Her connection to him transcends physical space now. Or you can stay and learn to coexist with her, giving her the family she's craved while protecting your son from her more dangerous impulses. If you choose to stay, remember that Lucy is still at heart a 7-year-old girl who died afraid and alone. She responds to kindness, to inclusion, to being treated as the child she remains. But never forget that her need for companionship has twisted over 60 years of isolation. She will do whatever it takes to avoid being abandoned again. The wooden doll is the key. It contains part of her essence, her connection to her living self. As long as it remains intact, she retains some humanity. If it's ever destroyed, she'll become something else entirely, something that sees your son not as a friend, but as a possession to be kept at any cost. I'm sorry to burden you with this responsibility, but Lucy chose your family long before I understood what she was planning. Marcus belongs to her now in ways that go deeper than the physical world. Be patient. Be understanding. And above all, never try to separate them completely. That's when she becomes dangerous. Your great-uncle Ezra Johnson P.S. Check the loose floorboard under the kitchen sink. You'll find Lucy's diary pages there. Reading them will help you understand what you're dealing with. David set the letter down with hands that weren't entirely steady. Everything his rational mind wanted to reject was laid out in matter-of-fact language by someone who'd lived with this reality for 3 decades. He found the loose floorboard exactly where Ezra had indicated. Beneath it was a small metal box containing pages torn from a child's diary. The paper yellowed with age, but the pencil markings still clear. The entries were dated from late 1962. Through early 1963, November 15th, 1962, Daddy finished my room today. It's upstairs with windows that look out at the mountains. Mama says when spring comes we can plant a garden and I can have my own section for flowers. I can't wait to show my friends when they come visit. December 3rd, 1962, the snow is getting deep. Daddy says we might be stuck here until spring, but that's okay because we have enough food and firewood. I like it when it's just the 3 of us. Mama reads to me every night, and Daddy is teaching me to carve animals from wood. January 10th, 1963. We're almost out of food. Daddy and Mama argue when they think I'm sleeping, but I can hear them. They're scared about something, but they won't tell me what. I made a doll to keep me company. She has yellow hair like mine, and I named her Lucy, too. January 28th, 1963, Daddy and Mama went to town for supplies. They said they'd be back before dark, but it's been snowing all day, and they're not back yet. I'm not scared because I have my doll and she talks to me. She says Mama and Daddy will come back soon. February 2, 1963, they're not coming back. My doll Lucy told me what happened. She showed me in dreams. The car went off the road and they can't come back ever. But doll Lucy says she'll take care of me. She says we can stay here together forever and I won't have to be alone. February 8th, 1963. I'm getting very cold and hungry. There's no more food except some crackers. Doll Lucy says not to worry, that soon we'll be together always and I won't need food anymore. She says she's been waiting for someone like me to be her real sister. I think she means we're going to die together. February 14th, 1963, today, I understand. Doll Lucy isn't just a toy. She's me from the future, me after I die. Come back to help me not be scared. She says dying isn't really dying if you love someone enough to stay with them. She says someday another little boy or girl will come here and I can be their friend forever. I won't be alone anymore. The final entry was written in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky. February 15th, 1963, I'm very sleepy now, and it doesn't hurt to be cold anymore. Doll Lucy is singing to me. She says tomorrow we'll start waiting together for our new family to come home. I'm not scared now. I'm going to have a brother or sister someday, and we'll play together always. David closed the diary pages, his throat tight with emotion. Lucy had died alone, comforting herself with the fantasy that death was just the beginning of a longer wait for companionship. No 7-year-old should have faced such terror and abandonment, but understanding her tragedy didn't make the current situation less dangerous. The next morning, David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Marcus about Lucy or trying to separate them, he decided to acknowledge her presence directly. Lucy, he said aloud while preparing breakfast, Marcus still asleep in his room. I know you're here. I know what happened to you. The kitchen grew noticeably colder. A cabinet door that had been closed swung open silently. I read your diary pages. I'm sorry you had to go through that alone. David continued cooking eggs, trying to keep his voice steady and compassionate. Marcus told me you've been taking good care of the cabin, waiting for us to come home. The radio in the main room turned on. In playing a children's song from the 1950s, David took it as acknowledgement. I want you to know that you're welcome here. Marcus seems happy to have a friend, and I respect that this was your home first. David plated the eggs, adding toast from bread that had stayed mysteriously fresh, despite being days past its expiration date. But I need you to understand that Marcus is my son, and I need to keep him safe. Can we work together on that? The song on the radio changed to something softer, more melodic. The kitchen temperature returned to normal. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, the wooden doll tucked under his arm. Were you talking to Lucy? Marcus asked. I was. I think it's time we all got properly introduced. Marcus grinned, the expression transforming his face with pure joy. She's so happy you finally believe in her. Dad, she says she's been waiting for a grown-up to understand. Over breakfast, David listened as Marcus relayed Lucy's responses to questions David couldn't hear. She was pleased they were staying permanently. She liked that David fixed things around the cabin. It made the place feel more like a real home again. She wanted to show them both the upstairs rooms she'd been working on. Working on? David asked. She's been making them perfect for when we came, Marcus explained. A room for me, a room for her, and a room for you. She says families need their own spaces, but they should be close together. After breakfast, Marcus led David to what had been the solid back wall of the kitchen. But when Marcus placed his small hand against the wood paneling, a section swung inward like a hidden door. Beyond was a hallway that couldn't possibly fit within the cabin's structure, leading to stairs that climbed toward what should have been empty air above the roofline. Lucy says to be careful on the steps, Marcus advised. She's still working on making them completely solid. David tested the first stair cautiously. It felt real enough, supporting his weight without creaking. But when he looked back down the hallway, the kitchen doorway seemed impossibly far away. The upstairs defied every law of architecture David understood. 3 bedrooms arranged around a central sitting area, with windows that looked out over views of the forest from angles that shouldn't exist. The room Marcus showed him as his own was twice the size of the actual bedroom downstairs, with built-in bookshelves and a window seat overlooking a meadow David had never seen from ground level. This is Lucy's room, Marcus said. Opening another door, the bedroom beyond was frozen in 1962. A child's bed with a patchwork quilt, toys arranged with careful precision, clothes hanging in a closet that smelled of lavender and old wood. Family photographs covered the dresser, Harold and Margaret Whitmore, with their blonde daughter, all 3 smiling at some long-ago family gathering. But in the photographs, David noticed, with growing unease, Lucy looked exactly as Marcus described her now. 7 years old, with blonde hair and a blue dress. Unchanged by 60 years of death, she says you can have the room at the end of the hall, Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to his father's discomfort. She made it big enough for all your tools and books. The room in question was indeed spacious, with a fireplace and windows facing 3 directions. It felt warm and welcoming, the kind of private space David had never been able to afford. But as they stood there, David heard something that made his blood chill. Footsteps in the hall behind them, light and quick. The sound of a child running excitedly from room to room. Marcus heard them too, and smiled. She's so happy we're finally home. David realized with crystal clarity that they weren't just staying in Lucy's cabin anymore. They were living in Lucy's reality, a place where death was negotiable and loneliness. It could reshape the world itself. The question was whether they were guests in this supernatural home or prisoners who didn't yet understand the terms of their captivity. October arrived with an early frost that turned the aspen leaves to gold and sent the first warnings of winter down from the high peaks. David had been living in Lucy's expanded reality for 6 weeks now, and the boundaries between normal and supernatural had become increasingly blurred. The bathroom mirror started showing messages. David first noticed it while shaving on a Tuesday morning. Condensation from his hot shower had fogged the glass, and when he wiped it clear, words appeared in the remaining moisture. "Stay with me." The letters looked as if they'd been traced by a small finger from behind the glass. David wiped the mirror completely clean and stepped back. Within seconds, new condensation formed and more words appeared. "Don't leave like they did." "Lucy," David said aloud, "I'm not going anywhere. This is our home now." The mirror cleared instantly, remaining fog-free for the rest of his routine. Marcus seemed oblivious to these more dramatic manifestations of Lucy's presence. To him, she was simply his constant companion and playmate. He'd adapted to her supernatural nature with the easy acceptance children showed toward things adults found impossible. But David noticed changes in his son that went beyond normal adjustment to their new life. Marcus had started speaking differently, occasionally using phrases and pronunciations that belonged to an earlier era. He'd say things like, "That's swell, Dad," or refer to their car as an automobile. When David asked where he'd learned such expressions, Marcus would look puzzled, as if unaware he'd said anything unusual. More concerning was Marcus's growing knowledge of things he'd never been taught. He knew the names of local plants and could predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy. He'd started carving small animals from wood, displaying a skill level that should have taken years to develop. "Lucy's teaching me," Marcus explained when David asked about the carvings. "She learned from her daddy before he died. The wooden animals were exquisite. Deer, rabbits, birds, each one detailed and lifelike. But they all shared one disturbing characteristic. Their eyes were carved to look perpetually watchful, as if they were always alert for signs of abandonment. David's work relationships began suffering as the mountain isolation and supernatural stress took their toll. He'd taken a remote position with a Denver-based architectural firm, working from the cabin on renovation and design projects. But his productivity plummeted as he found himself constantly distracted by sounds, movements, and phenomena that demanded his attention. Phone calls with clients became exercises in concealing his growing agitation. He'd be explaining design concepts when Lucy would manifest some new supernatural display. Doors slamming in sequence, furniture rearranging itself, or the radio turning on at full volume to play children's songs from the 1940s. His supervisor, Janet Reeves, began expressing concern during their weekly video conferences. "David, you seem distracted lately. Are you settling in well to the mountain lifestyle?" "Just fine," David lied. While behind Janet's image on his laptop screen, he could see the kitchen cabinet doors opening and closing in a rhythm that resembled applause. "The isolation takes some adjustment, but Marcus loves it here. Maybe too much isolation. Have you considered enrolling him in more social activities? Children need interaction with peers." David almost laughed at the irony. Marcus was interacting with a peer constantly, just not one any other adult could see or understand. The local townspeople began treating David differently as autumn deepened. Their initial welcoming attitude cooled to polite distance, then to barely concealed concern. At the hardware store, Tom Bradley pulled David aside while Marcus browsed the fishing equipment. "How are you folks settling in up there?" "Very well, thanks. Why?" Tom's weathered face creased with worry. "It's just that some folks have been talking. Martha from the library mentioned you'd been asking questions about the Whitmore girl." David chose his words carefully. "I was curious about the cabin's history. Natural enough, I think. Course it is. But Dave, I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen 7 families try to make a go of that property. None of them lasted more than 2 years, and most left looking." Tom paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Looking like they'd seen things that changed them." "What kind of things?" Tom glanced around the store, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. Children who stopped playing with other kids, started talking to people who weren't there. Parents who grew jumpy and hollow-eyed, like they weren't sleeping well. Families that seemed to be under some kind of strain they couldn't explain. David felt recognition settle in his stomach, like a stone. "And you think that's happening to us?" "I think that place has a history, and history has a way of repeating itself. Your boy seems happy enough, but you..." Tom studied David's face with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of mountain winters. "You look like a man who's carrying more weight than he signed up for." That evening, David attempted to broach the subject of Lucy's intensifying presence with Marcus. They were sitting on the front porch after dinner, watching the last daylight fade behind the peaks. "Marcus, do you ever miss having other kids to play with?" "I have Lucy. She's the best friend I've ever had. But what about children your own age?" "Kids from school?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of pine with the carving knife Lucy had apparently taught him to use safely. "The kids at school don't understand things like Lucy does. They think different than us." The phrase "us" sent a chill through David. Marcus was beginning to identify more strongly with Lucy than with the living world. How does Lucy think differently? "She understands that families should stay together always. That when you love someone, you don't leave them, even if things get hard or scary." Marcus held up his carving, a small figure that looked remarkably like Lucy. Blonde hair and blue dress, rendered in miniature detail. "She says most people give up too easy on the people they're supposed to care about." David recognized the implicit accusation. Lucy was using Marcus to express criticism of the abandonment she'd suffered, but also of Jasmine's departure, and perhaps even David's own moments of doubt about their current situation. "Sometimes people leave because they think it's best for everyone involved," David said carefully. "That's what grown-ups always say when they want to quit." Marcus's voice carried a bitterness that belonged to someone much older. "But kids don't get to quit. Kids have to stay and deal with whatever happens." The next morning, David woke to find every photograph in the cabin turned face down. When he righted them, he discovered that additional figures had been added to each image. A blonde girl in a blue dress, standing slightly apart from the main subjects, but clearly part of the scene. In their family photos from the city, Lucy appeared in the background of Marcus's school pictures, at the edge of birthday celebrations. Even in candid shots David had taken of Marcus playing in their old apartment, she was rewriting their history, inserting herself into memories where she'd never existed. But most disturbing was the photo on David's nightstand, a recent shot of Marcus playing in the forest. Lucy stood beside him, her arm around his shoulders, both children smiling at the camera with expressions of absolute contentment. David had no memory of taking that photograph, and he was certain Lucy hadn't been visible when the picture was snapped. She was no longer just influencing their present reality. She was reconstructing their past to support the narrative that they'd always been a family, that her presence was natural and inevitable rather than supernatural and invasive. When David showed the altered photos to Marcus, his son displayed no surprise. "Lucy says families should be together in all their pictures," Marcus explained matter-of-factly. "She was always with us even before we knew she was there. Now the pictures just show the truth." David realized with growing horror that Lucy wasn't just keeping them in the cabin. She was gradually erasing their identities as separate individuals, replacing their independent memories and relationships with a collective identity that centered around her needs and desires. The question was no longer whether they could leave. The question was whether enough of who they'd been would survive for leaving to have any meaning. By November, David could no longer distinguish between Lucy's supernatural interventions and the normal rhythms of their life. She had woven herself so thoroughly into their daily existence that questioning her presence felt like questioning reality itself. The family photographs were just the beginning. David's memories began changing. He'd recall events from Marcus's early childhood and find Lucy present in the recollections, playing with Marcus as a toddler, helping with bedtime routines, even comforting the boy during his mother's departure. These memories felt completely authentic, carrying the emotional weight and sensory detail of lived experience. But David knew they were false. Lucy had been dead for decades when Marcus was born. The realization that his own mind was being altered sent David into a spiral of questioning everything. If Lucy could change photographs and memories, what else was she manipulating? Were his feelings of growing contentment with their isolated lifestyle genuine, or were they being artificially induced? Marcus showed no awareness of the reality distortions. To him, Lucy had always been part of their family. He'd talk about things she'd done last year or when I was little, seamlessly incorporating impossible memories into his understanding of their history. During a video call with his work supervisor, David found himself struggling to remember details about their life before the cabin. "How long have you been living in Colorado?" Janet asked, reviewing his personnel file. David opened his mouth to say 8 months, then stopped. The answer felt wrong, but he couldn't access the correct information. "Several years," he said finally, the response coming from some source deeper than conscious memory. "That's strange. According to your file, you relocated there just this past spring." David stared at the screen, unable to reconcile the discrepancy. In his mind, they'd always lived in the mountains. Marcus had always attended Pine Ridge Elementary. The city apartment felt like something from a dream or a story he'd heard about someone else's life. "I think there might be an error in the file," David said, ending the call abruptly. He spent the afternoon trying to reconstruct their timeline, using physical evidence like receipts and documents to verify the facts his memory could no longer access reliably. According to the paper trail, they'd arrived in Colorado in late spring. But according to his increasingly Lucy-influenced recollections, they'd been mountain residents for years. The supernatural was becoming indistinguishable from the natural. Marcus's schoolwork began reflecting knowledge he shouldn't possess. His essays about local history contained details that weren't in any textbook, personal anecdotes about families who'd lived in Pine Ridge decades before he was born. Accurate descriptions of buildings and landmarks that had been torn down before his arrival. When his teacher, Mrs. Henderson, asked where he'd learned such specific information, "Marcus would look confused, Lucy told me," he'd say. As if that explained everything, Mrs. Henderson called David to express concern. Marcus is a bright boy, but some of his answers in class are unusual. He talks about local events from the 1960s as if he witnessed them personally. Yesterday he described the interior of the old Whitmore house in detail, including rooms that don't appear in any photographs or records. David felt the familiar chill of recognition. Is it affecting his academic performance? Not exactly. His work is excellent, but it's historically accurate in ways that should be impossible for a child his age. It's as if he has access to information that was never written down, because he did. Lucy was sharing her memories with Marcus, giving him first-hand knowledge of events she'd witnessed as a living child, and continued observing as a supernatural presence. David began experiencing Lucy's presence more directly himself. She no longer limited her interactions to moving objects and writing messages. Now she would sit beside him while he worked, her presence creating a cold spot that moved with her as she shifted position. Sometimes he could almost see her in his peripheral vision, a small figure in a blue dress, watching him with the intense focus of a child seeking approval. The first time he heard her voice clearly was on a Thursday evening while he prepared dinner. "You're a good daddy," the voice said, thin and sweet, carrying the dialect patterns of an earlier era. "Marcus is lucky to have someone who stays with him." David froze with a spoon halfway to his mouth, tasting the soup he'd been stirring. "Thank you," he said aloud, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to respond. "My daddy was good too, before he had to go away. He didn't want to leave me, but sometimes grown-ups don't get to choose." David set down the spoon, understanding that Lucy was offering him something precious, direct communication about her trauma and abandonment. "I'm not going anywhere, Lucy. This is our home now. I know. That's why I picked you and Marcus. I've been watching families for a long time, waiting for the right ones. Ones who understand that families should stay together no matter what." The conversation felt surreal but necessary. Lucy needed reassurance, and David was beginning to understand that providing it was essential for maintaining any stability in their supernatural arrangement. What happened to the other families? The ones who left. There was a long pause. When Lucy spoke again, Her voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo through the cabin's walls. They got scared when I tried to show them how much I loved them. They didn't understand that I just wanted us to be together forever. So I had to let them go before they could hurt Marcus the way other people hurt me. David realized, with crystalline clarity, that Lucy had been testing the previous families, escalating her supernatural manifestations until they fled. But Marcus was different. Marcus accepted her completely, which meant she had no reason to let this family go, ever. That night, David attempted to research their situation online, looking for information about supernatural attachments and how to break them safely. But every search led to dead ends. Websites that should have contained relevant information displayed error messages. His internet connection, normally reliable, became intermittent whenever he tried to access resources about ghostly encounters or spiritual liberation. Lucy was monitoring and controlling his access to information. The realization sent David into his first genuine panic attack since arriving at the cabin. He sat on the bathroom floor, gasping for air, while the mirror above him displayed a repeating message, "Don't be afraid, we're family now." When Marcus found him there 20 minutes later, David was still struggling to breathe normally. "Dad, are you sick?" "Just tired, buddy. I'll be okay." Marcus knelt beside him with the wooden doll tucked under his arm, his expression filled with concern that seemed older than his 8 years. "Lucy says you're worried about things changing, but change isn't always bad. She says sometimes families have to become different to stay together." David looked into his son's eyes and saw something that terrified him. Marcus was beginning to look at the world through Lucy's perspective, viewing their supernatural imprisonment as a form of protection rather than captivity. "What kind of different?" David asked, like her. "She says dying isn't really dying if the people who love you won't let you go. She says maybe someday we can all be the same kind of together." David understood then that Lucy's ultimate plan wasn't just to keep them in the cabin. She wanted to make them like her, spirits bound to the property, unable to leave, sustained by supernatural loneliness rather than natural life. She wanted them to die and stay with her forever. And Marcus, in his innocent acceptance of her love, was already halfway convinced that such a transformation would be a gift rather than a horror. The truth came to David on a December morning when he was cleaning out Lucy's room, looking for anything that might help him understand her connection to Marcus. Hidden beneath the floorboards under her bed, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it for decades, he found a manila envelope containing documents that changed everything he thought he knew about their situation. The first document was Marcus's birth certificate, but it wasn't the copy David kept in their important papers. This was an original, issued by Pine Ridge General Hospital on March 15, 2016. Marcus had been born in the cabin. David's hands shook as he read the details. Mother, Sarah Elizabeth Chen. Father, David Anthony Johnson. Place of birth, 1247 Pine Ridge Road, Pine Ridge, Colorado. But David had no memory of Sarah being pregnant in Colorado. In his recollections, Marcus had been born in Denver General Hospital while they lived in the city apartment. Except now, staring at official documentation, David couldn't access those urban memories with any clarity. They felt like stories he'd heard secondhand rather than experiences he'd lived. The second document was a medical record from Dr. Patricia Walsh, the local physician who'd apparently attended Marcus's birth. Her notes described a difficult labor during a severe winter storm that had made hospital transport impossible. She delivered the baby in the cabin's main room while winds howled outside and power lines went down throughout the valley. Notes also described Sarah's growing agitation during the final weeks of pregnancy. She'd complained of voices calling to her unborn child, of dreams in which a blonde girl played with a baby boy, of rooms in the cabin that appeared and disappeared depending on her mental state. Patient exhibits signs of extreme stress and possible postpartum psychosis, Dr. Walsh had written. She insists that a deceased child is communicating with her unborn baby. Recommend psychiatric evaluation once transport to town becomes possible. David found Sarah's own handwritten account tucked behind the medical records. Her writing was hurried, desperate, documenting experiences that paralleled everything David was now living through. She's been waiting for him. I can feel her excitement growing stronger as my due date approaches. She whispers to him through my belly, singing lullabies from the 1940s. When I sleep, I dream of a little girl who shows me through rooms that don't exist, preparing a nursery for my baby. David doesn't believe me when I tell him about the voices, the moving objects, the photographs that change when we're not looking. He thinks it's pregnancy hormones making me paranoid. But I know what I'm experiencing. The girl died here 60 years ago, but she's not gone. She's been waiting for the right baby, one she can claim as her brother. She's been calling Marcus to her since he was conceived. I think she somehow influenced us coming here, made David's great-uncle leave him this property specifically because she knew we'd have a child. I have to get Marcus away from her before he's born. Once he arrives, she'll have too strong a connection to break. But David won't leave. He's already under her influence, though he doesn't realize it. The final entry was dated 2 days after Marcus's birth. She's got him now. From the moment Marcus opened his eyes, he looked toward corners of the room where she stands. He stops crying when she sings to him. When I try to take him away from the places where she's strongest, he becomes inconsolable. David thinks I'm having a breakdown, but I'm the only one seeing clearly. Lucy has what she's been waiting for, a living child who can see and hear her, who will grow up thinking of her as family. I have to leave. If I stay, I'll become like David, convinced that this supernatural arrangement is normal and healthy. She's already changing my memories, making me forget life before the cabin. I'm taking Marcus and going tonight while David sleeps. I'll drive to Sarah's sister in California. David will follow when he realizes what's happening here, when he breaks free from her influence. But if he doesn't come, if she keeps him too, then at least Marcus will be safe. David found the rest of the story in a letter addressed to him. Sealed but never sent. David, by the time you read this, I'll be gone and Marcus will be safe. I know you think I'm abandoning you both, but I'm trying to save our son from something you can't see yet. Lucy Whitmore died in this cabin, but death didn't release her. She's been trapped here by loneliness and the desperate need for family. She chose Marcus before he was born, calling him to her through dreams and supernatural influence. I've felt her in my mind for months, changing my memories, making me believe we've always lived here. She's doing the same to you. By the time you realize what's happening, it may be too late to break free. Marcus was born here because she wanted him born here. Every decision we made to come to this place, to stay despite the strangeness, has been guided by her influence. We haven't been making our own choices. I'm taking our baby somewhere she can't follow, somewhere he can grow up without her whispering in his ear that death is just another form of family togetherness. If you ever break free from her hold on your mind, come find us. Marcus needs his father, but he needs you as yourself, not as Lucy's idea of what a father should be. I love you. That's why I'm doing this. Sarah David sat on Lucy's bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence that his entire understanding of their situation was false. Marcus hadn't been gradually influenced by Lucy after their arrival. He'd been claimed by her from birth. His supernatural connection wasn't new. It was 8 years old, and Sarah hadn't abandoned them. She'd tried to save them. The memories started returning in fragments, not the false memories Lucy had constructed, but real ones she'd buried beneath layers of supernatural manipulation. David remembered Sarah's growing paranoia during her pregnancy, her insistence that they leave the cabin immediately after Marcus's birth. He remembered dismissing her fears as hormonal imbalance, refusing to take her concerns seriously. He remembered waking up one morning to find both Sarah and Marcus gone, finding only a note saying she needed time to think clearly. He'd assumed she'd left because motherhood overwhelmed her, but she'd left because Lucy was claiming their child, and David had been too deep under supernatural influence to recognize the danger. The false memories of Marcus's city childhood, of Sarah abandoning them in an urban apartment, of their recent arrival in Colorado. All of it was Lucy's construction, designed to make their current situation seem like a positive choice rather than a supernatural trap that had claimed them years ago. Marcus had never lived anywhere but this cabin. He'd never known life without Lucy's constant presence. His easy acceptance of supernatural phenomena wasn't childhood adaptability. It was the result of 8 years of conditioning by a lonely spirit who'd claimed him as her eternal companion. David heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly hid the documents. Marcus appeared in the doorway, the wooden doll in his arms, his expression puzzled. "Dad, why are you sitting in Lucy's room?" "Just looking around, buddy. Learning more about our family history." Marcus tilted his head, studying his father with eyes that seemed older than 8 years should allow. "Lucy says you found something that's making you sad." "Not sad, just understanding things better." She says understanding isn't always good. Sometimes people understand too much, and then they try to change things that are already perfect. David felt the implicit warning in Marcus's words, or rather, in Lucy's words delivered through Marcus. She knew he'd discovered the truth about their situation. She was prepared to escalate her control to prevent him from acting on that knowledge. "What do you think, Marcus? Do you think our life here is perfect?" Marcus's expression grew dreamy, distant. "I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be. Lucy and me have been waiting for you to come home for such a long time. Why would we want to change that?" David realized with heart-stopping clarity that Marcus had no memory of Sarah. 8 years of supernatural manipulation had erased his mother from his mind completely. In Marcus's reality, it had always been just him, David, and Lucy, the perfect family Lucy had been constructing since the day of his birth. "What about your mother?" David asked carefully. Marcus looked genuinely confused. "What about her? Don't you remember her? Don't you miss her?" "Dad, you're being silly. Lucy's like my mother. She takes care of me and teaches me things and loves me. Why would I need another one?" David understood then that Sarah's escape had been only partially successful. She'd saved herself, but Lucy had kept Marcus by erasing all memory of her existence. The boy had no idea that his mother had fought to save him, had left to protect him from exactly what he was now experiencing. Lucy had won 8 years ago. Everything since then had been an elaborate performance designed to make David believe they'd chosen their current life rather than been trapped in it from the beginning. The only question now was whether David could find a way to break free from 8 years of supernatural conditioning, reclaim his own memory and identity, and somehow save a son who no longer remembered that he needed saving. David spent the next 3 days in a state of carefully concealed desperation, planning an escape while pretending that everything was normal. He had to assume Lucy was monitoring his thoughts and actions, so every movement had to appear routine while serving a deeper purpose. First, he created multiple backup plans, each designed to account for different supernatural interventions. He mapped every possible exit route from the property, noting places where the forest was densest and might provide cover. He researched winter driving conditions and identified safe houses in surrounding towns where they might find temporary refuge. But every plan faced the same fundamental challenge. Marcus didn't want to leave. Convincing an 8-year-old to abandon the only home he remembered, the only family structure he'd ever known, would require David to break through 8 years of supernatural conditioning in a matter of hours. The escape supplies had to be gathered secretly. David used his weekly trips to town as opportunities to purchase items that could serve double purposes. Camping gear that he claimed was for spring hiking trips, extra gasoline that he said was for the generator, warm clothing that appeared to be routine winter preparation. He hid the supplies in the shed behind the cabin, in toolboxes and storage containers that Lucy seemed less interested in monitoring. But even as he made these preparations, David suspected she was aware of his activities and simply allowing them to continue for her own reasons. On the 4th day, David found a way to contact Sarah, using the library's computer during a research trip to town. David searched public records for Sarah Chen, It took hours of careful detective work, cross-referencing birth certificates, employment records, and property transfers. But he finally found her living in Sacramento under her maiden name. The phone call was the most difficult conversation of David's life. "Sarah? This is David Johnson. I know it's been 8 years, but I need to talk to you about Marcus." The silence on the other end lasted so long, David thought she'd hung up. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice carried a wariness that spoke to years of looking over her shoulder. "David, how did you find me? Are you—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Are you yourself, or are you still under her influence?" "I found the documents you hid in Lucy's room. I remember everything now. Marcus being born at the cabin, your attempts to warn me, your escape to protect him." "Sarah, I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." Another long silence. "Where is Marcus now?" "He's with her. He's been with her his entire life. She erased all memory of you from his mind, made him believe she's the only mother figure he's ever known." David heard Sarah crying softly on the other end of the line. "I tried to take him with me," she whispered. "But every time I got him away from the cabin, he would become so distressed, so physically ill, that I was afraid he might die. The supernatural connection was already too strong. How did you break free?" "Distance. The further I got from Pine Ridge, the clearer my thinking became. But it took months to fully remember who I was before Lucy started changing my mind. Even now, sometimes I have dreams about the cabin that feel more real than my actual life." David explained his current situation. Marcus's complete integration with Lucy's reality. The false memories that had convinced David they'd only recently arrived at the cabin. The gradual revelation of how long they'd actually been trapped. "She's gotten stronger," Sarah said. 8 years of having Marcus has made her more powerful, more able to manipulate reality. "David, I don't think you can save him by running. She'll follow and she'll escalate until what? Until she makes the choice for him. Lucy doesn't just want Marcus as a living companion. She wants him to join her permanently, to become like her, a spirit bound to the cabin forever. That way he can never leave, never grow up, never choose anyone over her." David felt ice in his veins. "How long do we have?" "She's been patient because she believed she had complete control. But if she realizes you're planning to take Marcus away, she'll accelerate her timeline. David, you have to understand. In her mind, she's saving him from the abandonment she suffered. She thinks transforming him into a spirit is an act of love." Sarah provided crucial information about Lucy's vulnerabilities and the supernatural rules that seemed to govern her existence. The wooden doll was indeed central to her power, but it couldn't be simply destroyed. Doing so would likely kill Marcus along with Lucy. Given how intertwined their essences had become, the doll has to be willingly released, Sarah explained. Lucy has to choose to let Marcus go, but she'll never make that choice unless she's convinced it's in his best interest. How do we convince a dead child to accept abandonment again? We don't convince her to accept abandonment. We convince her to accept growth. Lucy died at 7 and has been frozen at that emotional age ever since. But Marcus is 8 now, getting older. Part of her recognizes that keeping him forever means denying him the chance to become the man he's supposed to be. Sarah's insights gave David the framework for a plan that went beyond simple escape. He had to help Lucy understand that true love meant allowing the people you care about to make their own choices, even when those choices involved separation. But first, he had to survive what was likely to be Lucy's most dangerous phase, the period when she realized he was no longer under her complete control. The supernatural activity escalated dramatically as soon as David returned to the cabin. Lucy had clearly been monitoring his phone call and understood that her carefully constructed reality was under threat. Objects began moving violently throughout the cabin. Doors slammed repeatedly, windows rattled in their frames, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. The radio turned on at full volume, playing children's songs at a tempo that sounded frantic and desperate. Marcus seemed oblivious to the chaos, sitting calmly in the main room with the wooden doll in his lap. both of them watching David with expressions of profound disappointment. "Lucy's upset," Marcus said, his voice carrying an unusual formality. "She thought you understood that we're supposed to be together forever. She's sad that you want to break up our family. Marcus, can you and I talk privately? Just the two of us? Lucy is part of us. She doesn't want to be left out anymore." David realized that the supernatural tantrum wasn't random violence. It was Lucy's equivalent of a child's emotional breakdown, the desperate reaction of someone who'd been abandoned before and couldn't bear the thought of experiencing that trauma again. "Lucy," David said aloud, addressing her directly, "I understand you're scared, but this isn't the way to handle fear." The violent activity paused. In the sudden silence, David heard Lucy's voice more clearly than ever before, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a 7-year-old in distress. "You want to take Marcus away like she did. You want to leave me alone again. No, Lucy, I want to help you understand that loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when that's scary for you. What's best is staying together forever. That's what families do." David sat down across from Marcus, noting how the boy's eyes tracked movements that David couldn't see, following Lucy's pacing around the room. "Lucy, Marcus is growing up. He's 8 years old now, older than you were when you died. If you keep him here forever, he'll never get to experience all the things you didn't get to experience. Graduating from school, learning to drive, falling in love, having children of his own. He doesn't need those things. He has me, but those things are part of being human. By keeping him from them, you're not protecting him. You're making him like you, trapped and unable to grow." The temperature in the room continued to drop, and frost began forming on the windows, despite the heating system running at full capacity. "I won't be alone again." Lucy's voice had taken on a quality that was less childlike and more desperate, tinged with the supernatural power she'd accumulated over decades. "I won't let anyone leave me again." David understood then that he was dealing with something that had moved beyond normal childhood trauma. Lucy's decades of isolation and supernatural existence had twisted her love into something that was possessive and ultimately destructive. The final confrontation wouldn't just be about convincing her to release Marcus. It would be about helping her choose between the desperate, grasping love born from abandonment and the sacrificial love that could finally allow her to rest. Outside, the winter storm that had been threatening all week finally arrived, bringing with it winds that howled through the forest like voices of the long dead. David realized with grim certainty that Lucy had been waiting for this storm, the same kind of weather that had killed her parents and trapped her in the cabin 60 years ago. She intended to recreate the conditions of her own death. But this time, she wouldn't face the terror alone. This time, she planned to take Marcus with her into whatever lay beyond the boundary between life and death. The storm hit with supernatural intensity, as if Lucy was channeling 60 years of accumulated loneliness into the wind and snow that battered the cabin. Power lines went down within the first hour, plunging them into a darkness lit only by the fireplace and oil lamps that had appeared throughout the rooms. Lamps, David was certain, hadn't been there that morning. Marcus sat unnaturally still in his chair, the wooden doll clutched against his chest, his eyes tracking Lucy's increasingly frantic movements around the room. David could sense her presence more clearly now, a cold spot that moved with desperate energy, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "She's scared," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an adult understanding that chilled David more than the supernatural cold. "She remembers the last time there was a storm like this." Through the frosted windows, David could barely make out the forest through the driving snow. The wind created sounds that resembled voices calling from the darkness. Harold and Margaret. Whitmore's final moments echoing across 6 decades. David knew he had to act before Lucy's fear overwhelmed what remained of her rational thinking. He moved slowly to the storage chest where he'd hidden his research materials, pulling out the one item Sarah had told him might be crucial to breaking through Lucy's supernatural defenses. It was Lucy's original teddy bear, the one possession from her living years that Ezra had preserved, unlike the wooden doll that had become a vessel for her supernatural power. The teddy bear represented her humanity, the frightened 7-year-old who had died alone and afraid. The moment David revealed the bear, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. Frost spread across the walls in patterns that looked like desperate handwriting, spelling out the same word over and over. "Mine, Lucy," David said gently, holding the bear where she could see it. "I know you remember this. It was with you at the end, wasn't it? When you were scared and hungry and waiting for your parents to come home." Marcus gasped, his eyes widening as if he was seeing something David couldn't perceive. "She's crying," he whispered. "She's remembering being little and cold and alone." David knelt on the floor, placing the teddy bear in front of him like an offering. "You don't have to be that scared little girl anymore. Lucy, you've been carrying that fear for 60 years, letting it make your decisions for you." The supernatural activity in the room shifted from violent to mournful. Objects stopped slamming and started moving with the slow, careful precision of someone handling precious memories. Photographs rearranged themselves chronologically, showing Lucy's short life from baby pictures to the final school photo taken just weeks before her death. "Look at these pictures," David continued, his voice steady despite the otherworldly cold. "You were a happy child with parents who loved you. They didn't choose to abandon you. They tried to get back to you and couldn't." Lucy's voice, when it came, was smaller and more childlike than David had ever heard it. "They promised they'd come back before dark. They promised they wouldn't leave me alone, and they tried to keep that promise. They died trying to get back to you." Marcus stood slowly, the wooden doll still in his arms, and walked to where David knelt. The boy's movements had the careful quality of someone navigating between multiple realities. "Lucy," Marcus said, speaking to empty air, but with the confidence of someone addressing a visible friend. "My dad's right. Your mom and dad didn't want to leave you, just like my mom didn't want to leave me." David's breath caught. This was the first time Marcus had mentioned his mother since the supernatural conditioning had erased her from his memory. "Your mom?" David asked carefully. Marcus nodded, his expression confused but increasingly clear. "I remember her now. She had dark hair and she sang to me when I was scared. She left because she thought she was protecting me from something, didn't she?" "Yes, she did." "She left because she loved you enough to try to save you, even though it broke her heart." The wooden doll in Marcus's arms began to glow with a soft, warm light that contrasted sharply with the supernatural cold pervading the room. As it glowed, Marcus's expression grew more alert, more present, as if he was waking up from a long dream. "Lucy," Marcus said, addressing the empty air with growing conviction. "I understand now. You kept me here because you were scared of being alone again. But keeping someone because you're scared isn't the same as loving them." The frost on the windows began to melt, forming patterns that looked like tears running down glass. Through the storm, David heard a sound that raised the hair on his arms, the voice of a small child, crying with the desolation of someone who had carried unbearable sadness for far too long. "I just wanted a family." Lucy's voice came through Marcus, but the words carried her own intonation and pain. "I just wanted someone to stay with me and not go away." David reached out slowly and placed his hand over Marcus's, encompassing both the boy and the glowing wooden doll. "Lucy, we understand that now. But real families don't trap each other. Real families love each other enough to let each other make choices, even when those choices are hard." The cabin door opened without anyone touching it, letting in a swirl of snow and wind that should have been impossible given the storm's intensity. Through the opening stepped a figure David recognized from the photographs, Sarah, older and more weathered than when he'd last seen her 8 years ago. But unmistakably Marcus's mother, I felt him calling to me. Sarah said, her voice carrying over the storm's howl. When his memories started coming back, when Lucy's hold began weakening, I could sense it from 1,000 miles away. Marcus stared at his mother with the wonder of someone rediscovering a lost piece of himself. "Mama?" The wooden doll's glow intensified as Sarah moved closer, and through that light, David finally saw Lucy clearly. She stood beside Marcus, a small girl in a blue dress that had faded with decades of supernatural existence, her blonde hair falling around a face that held all the loneliness of the ages. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly, speaking directly to Lucy. "You're just a little girl who missed her parents too much." Lucy's horn flickered between the confident, supernatural entity she'd become and the frightened child she'd originally been. "You came back," she whispered, the words carrying decades of abandonment and hope. "I came back because Marcus is my son, and I never stopped loving him," Sarah replied. "Just like your parents never stopped loving you, even after they died." The three adults, David, Sarah, and the spirit of a 7-year-old who had been trapped between worlds for 60 years, formed a circle around Marcus, who clutched the glowing doll with growing understanding. "Lucy," Marcus said, his voice carrying a maturity that came from finally seeing his situation clearly. "You've been taking care of me my whole life, haven't you? Making sure I wasn't lonely like you were." Lucy nodded, tears streaming down her translucent face. "I wanted to be your sister forever. I wanted us to never have to say goodbye, but I'm not supposed to be like you," Marcus continued gently. "I'm supposed to grow up and have adventures and maybe have kids of my own someday. If you keep me here, I'll miss all of that." The storm outside began to quiet, as if the weather itself was listening to the conversation. "What if you forget me?" Lucy asked, the question containing all the fear that had driven her actions for 6 decades. Sarah knelt down to Marcus's level, reaching out to touch the wooden doll. As her fingers made contact, David could see her more clearly too, not just as a supernatural presence, but as a real child who had been shaped by trauma into something else. "Lucy," Sarah said, "forgetting and growing up aren't the same thing. Marcus will carry you with him wherever he goes, but as a happy memory of someone who loved him, not as a chain keeping him from living." Lucy looked back and forth between the three of them, the father who had finally understood, the mother who had returned, and the boy who had outgrown his need for supernatural protection. "If I let him go, will I be alone again?" David found himself answering with a certainty that surprised him. "No, Lucy, you won't be alone. Your parents have been waiting for you all this time, just on the other side of whatever boundary you've been afraid to cross." "How do you know?" "Because that's what parents do. They wait. And when you're ready to stop being afraid, they'll be there to hold you and tell you that everything's going to be all right." Lucy's form began to solidify, becoming more childlike and less supernatural entity. As she changed, the cabin around them started to shift as well. The impossible upstairs rooms faded away, the extended basement contracted to normal dimensions, and the supernatural additions Lucy had created over the decades dissolved back into memory. "I don't know how to stop being scared," Lucy admitted. Marcus stepped forward and, in a gesture that broke David's heart with its simple compassion, offered the wooden doll to Lucy. "You don't have to stop being scared," Marcus said. "You just have to be brave enough to trust that love doesn't end when people go away. It changes, but it doesn't end." Lucy reached out with hands that were becoming more translucent by the moment and accepted the doll. As soon as she touched it, both she and the doll began to glow with a warm golden light that filled the cabin with peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice already fading. "Thank you for teaching me that letting go can be another way of loving someone." The light grew brighter, and through it, David could see the shadowy figures of Harold and Margaret Whitmore, their arms outstretched toward their daughter with expressions of infinite patience and love. Lucy turned back to Marcus one last time. "Will you remember me?" "Always," Marcus promised. "You were my first friend, and you taught me that families can love each other even when they can't be together." Lucy smiled, the first truly peaceful expression David had seen on her face. Then she walked toward her parents, her small hand clasped in her father's, her mother's arm around her shoulders. As the three figures faded into light, the storm outside finally ended, leaving behind a silence that felt like benediction rather than emptiness. The cabin was just a cabin again, old, weathered, but no longer haunted by anything more dangerous than memory. 6 months later, David stood in the backyard of their new home in Boulder, watching Marcus teach his mother how to carve wooden animals. The boy's supernatural connection to Lucy had faded with her peaceful departure, but the skills she'd taught him remained, a positive legacy from their unusual friendship. "See, you have to feel where the wood wants to break," Marcus explained to Sarah, guiding her hands as she worked on a small rabbit. "Lucy always said the animals are already in there. You just have to help them come out." Sarah smiled, her patience with the task reflecting the gradual healing of their family bonds. She'd moved back to Colorado 3 months after Lucy's departure, taking a teaching position in Boulder that allowed her to be close without overwhelming Marcus with too much change too quickly. The transition hadn't been seamless. Marcus struggled initially with the loss of his supernatural companion, experiencing a grief that was complicated by relief. For 8 years, Lucy had been his constant companion, teacher, and protector. Learning to exist without her presence required rebuilding his sense of identity and independence. "Sometimes I still hear her voice," Marcus had confided to David during one of their evening talks. "Not like when she was trapped here, but like remembering a friend who moved away. She tells me I'm doing good, growing up the way I'm supposed to." David had learned to trust these residual connections rather than fear them. Lucy's voice in Marcus's memory carried only encouragement now, the healthy influence of someone who had found peace and wanted the same for those she'd left behind. The cabin in Pine Ridge stood empty, but no longer abandoned. David had decided to keep the property, visiting monthly to maintain the building and grounds. The townspeople noticed the change immediately. Where once the place had radiated isolation and unease, it now felt simply quiet, the normal stillness of a house waiting for its next chapter. Tom Bradley at the hardware store had been the first to comment on the transformation. "Don't know what you folks did up there," he'd said, during one of David's supply runs, "but the whole mountain feels different. Like something that was holding its breath finally learned how to let it out." David had donated most of Ezra's research materials to the local historical society, but he'd kept Lucy's diary pages and the family photographs, not as supernatural artifacts, but as reminders of how loneliness could twist love into possession if left untended. His relationship with Sarah was rebuilding slowly, carefully, with the patience of two people who understood that some wounds required time to heal properly. They weren't rushing toward reconciliation, but they weren't avoiding it either. Marcus needed both parents, and both parents needed to learn how to be themselves again after years of supernatural influence. "We're different people than we were 8 years ago," Sarah had said during one of their weekly family dinners. "Maybe that's not entirely bad. We understand things now that most people never have to learn." David knew she was right. The experience with Lucy had taught them all about the difference between love that held too tightly and love that supported growth. It had shown them that family wasn't just about being together, but about helping each other become who they were meant to be. Marcus started 4th grade in Boulder with an adjustment period that was surprisingly smooth. His teachers noted his maturity and empathy, his unusual ability to comfort classmates who were struggling with their own fears and transitions. The supernatural experiences had left him with a deep understanding of loneliness and the importance of genuine connection. He made friends quickly. But David noticed that Marcus was drawn to children who seemed isolated or different. The new kid, the shy girl, the boy with the unusual hobbies. Lucy had taught him to recognize people who needed companionship, and he offered it freely without expecting anything in return. "I think Lucy would be proud of how I'm using what she taught me," Marcus told David one evening while they worked together in their vegetable garden. "She always said families should take care of each other, but I think she meant all kinds of families, not just the ones you're born into." David planted tomato seedlings while considering his son's wisdom. "What do you think she meant by that?" "I think she meant that everyone needs someone who won't give up on them, even when things get scary or hard. She never gave up on us, even when her way of not giving up wasn't healthy. Now I can be that person for other kids who need it. That evening, as David tucked Marcus into bed in his new room, a space filled with normal 8-year-old possessions rather than supernatural mysteries, he reflected on how much they'd all learned about the nature of love and loss. "Dad," Marcus said as David turned off the bedside lamp, "do you think Lucy found what she was looking for?" "I think she found peace," David replied. "And I think she found the kind of family she'd been dreaming about all along, one that loved her enough to help her grow, even when growing meant letting go. That's what real families do, isn't it? They love you enough to let you become yourself." David kissed his son's forehead, marveling at the wisdom that had emerged from their supernatural ordeal. That's exactly what real families do. Outside, the Colorado night was filled with normal sounds: traffic, neighbors calling to each other, the distant hum of the city. No supernatural whispers, no ghostly footsteps, no spirits trapped between worlds. Just the peaceful quiet of a family that had learned the difference between being held captive by love and being supported by it. In the living room, David found Sarah reading on the couch, a cup of tea steaming on the side table. She looked up as he entered, her expression holding the careful hope of someone who was learning to trust in happiness again. "He's settled in well," she observed. "Better than I expected. Lucy taught him a lot about resilience, even if her methods were unconventional." Sarah marked her place in the book and set it aside. "Do you think we'll be all right? All of us, I mean, as a family." David settled beside her, taking her hand in his. "I think we've learned something most families never have to learn, that love isn't about keeping people with you forever. It's about helping them become who they're supposed to be, even when that's scary." Outside their window, the lights of Boulder spread out below them like scattered stars, each one representing other families finding their own ways through the complexities of love, loss, and growth. They had been touched by the supernatural, changed by encounters with forces beyond normal understanding. But in the end, they had discovered something entirely natural: that the strongest love is the kind that can let go, when letting go is an act of faith in the future. It had taken a lonely spirit 60 years to learn that lesson. But once learned, it had freed them all to become who they were meant to be.